Chosen one. Before you scroll away, listen carefully. If you have felt like pieces of your life are quietly falling away lately, if people you once trusted seem distant, if places that once felt familiar suddenly feel uncomfortable, and if the things that used to bring you peace no longer satisfy your spirit the way they once did, this message may be for you. At first, it is easy to assume something is wrong. It is easy to believe life is working against you. It is easy to look at what is leaving and conclude that you are losing. But what if that is not what is happening at all? What if this season is not about loss? What if it is about transformation? Chosen one. There are moments in life when God begins preparing you for a different level of growth, and when that happens, the version of you that survived the previous season cannot fully enter the next one. That is why things feel different. Not because you are being abandoned, not because you are being punished, but because you are changing. Most people expect transformation to feel inspiring. In reality, it often feels confusing. It feels like outgrowing conversations you once enjoyed. It feels like questioning things you once accepted without thinking. It feels like standing between two versions of yourself, unable to return to who you were, yet unable to fully see who you are becoming. And that space can feel lonely. But do not mistake loneliness for failure. Do not mistake discomfort for defeat. Because sometimes the strongest sign that God is moving in your life is not what He is adding, it is what He is removing. And if you have been feeling this shift lately, there may be a reason your spirit was led to this message today. Chosen one. The truth is, what has been exhausting you lately is not only what happened to you, it is how long you have been carrying it. Most people see the surface of your life. They see you showing up. They see you smiling. They see you continuing to move forward. And because you kept functioning, they assumed you were fine. But they never saw the conversations you had with yourself late at night. They never saw the moments when you sat in silence, wondering how much longer you could keep carrying the weight that nobody else seemed to notice. What made this season difficult was not only the challenges themselves, it was the fact that you had to keep acting like they were not affecting you. You told people you were okay because explaining the truth became too exhausting. You said, "I'm fine," when your mind was full of questions. You said, "Everything is good," when your spirit felt tired. You kept showing strength because you felt like nobody would understand your struggle anyway, and after a while, pretending became a habit. Not because you wanted to deceive anyone, but because carrying pain quietly felt easier than explaining it repeatedly. Chosen one, many people think suffering comes from loss. But sometimes the deepest exhaustion comes from constantly holding yourself together while nobody realizes you are falling apart inside. That is why this season has felt heavier than you expected. Not because you are weak, but because you have been strong for too long. You kept giving when you felt empty. You kept encouraging others while secretly needing encouragement yourself. You kept showing up for people who never noticed how much effort it took for you just to make it through another day. And perhaps the hardest part was this. You began wondering whether all your effort even mattered. You started questioning whether anyone truly saw your sacrifices, whether God saw them, whether all the waiting, all the disappointments, all the silent battles were leading anywhere at all. Because when delays continue for long enough, they do something dangerous. They do not just test your patience, they test your identity. You begin asking questions that have nothing to do with circumstances. Questions like, am I enough? Did I miss my opportunity? Why does it seem easier for everyone else? Why am I still here while others move ahead? And little by little, those questions become heavier than the original problem itself. But listen carefully. The reason this season has felt so intense is not because you are failing, it is because you are standing between two versions of yourself. One version still wants certainty, the other is being taught faith. One version wants immediate answers. The other is learning trust. One version wants to stay where everything feels familiar. The other is being called into something greater. And that tension creates discomfort. It creates confusion. It creates emotional fatigue. Because growth rarely feels like growth while it is happening. It feels like loss. It feels like uncertainty. It feels like being misunderstood. But chosen one, what if the pressure you have been feeling is not evidence that something is wrong? What if it is evidence that something inside you is changing? What if this season was never designed to break you? What if it was designed to reveal the strength that was hidden beneath everything you thought you needed? Because the truth is, you are still here, after everything, after the disappointments, after the unanswered prayers, after the people who walked away, after the moments when giving up seemed easier than believing, you are still here. And that alone says more about who you are becoming than you may realize. Chosen one, there is a spiritual law that many people misunderstand, and because they misunderstand it, they mistake preparation for punishment. It is what I call the law of separation. The truth is, before God elevates someone, He often separates them, not because He wants to hurt them, not because He wants them to suffer, but because certain levels of growth cannot happen in the middle of constant noise. Look closely at the people God used throughout history. Before Abraham became the father of nations, he was called to leave what was familiar. Before Joseph entered the palace, he experienced rejection, betrayal, and years of isolation. Before Moses led a nation, he spent years in the wilderness where nobody celebrated him, noticed him, or understood what God was building inside him. The pattern appears again and again. First, separation. Then, preparation. Then, elevation. Yet when this process begins happening in our own lives, we often resist it. We assume something is wrong because people are leaving. We assume something is broken because we feel alone. We assume we are being forgotten because the crowd is no longer surrounding us. But chosen one, what if isolation is not evidence that God has stepped away? What if it is evidence that He has stepped closer? Because there are lessons God can teach you in solitude that cannot be learned in approval. There is wisdom developed in silence that cannot be developed in distraction. There is strength built in private that cannot be built in public. And this is why many people never reach the next level they pray for. They want elevation without separation. They want growth without discomfort. They want transformation without letting go. But God rarely elevates people while they are still dependent on the crowd. As long as your identity depends on being understood by everyone, the opinions of others will continue controlling your direction. As long as your confidence depends on constant validation, your peace will remain fragile. As long as you need the crowd to agree with your calling, you will struggle to hear God's voice clearly. Sometimes the very people you are trying hardest to keep are the same people preventing you from becoming who you were created to be. Not because they are bad, not because they are evil, but because they belong to a chapter that is ending. And one of the most difficult truths a chosen one must learn is this: every new level requires a different version of you. And every different version of you requires leaving something behind. That is why this season feels different. You are not simply losing connections, you are being detached from dependencies. You are not being abandoned, you are being repositioned. And although the process feels uncomfortable now, one day you will look back and realize that what felt like isolation was actually divine preparation for everything that came next. Chosen one, there is something deeper happening beneath the surface of your pain that most people never talk about. Many people believe that what hurts the most is losing someone, but that is not always true. Sometimes the deepest pain comes from losing the version of yourself that existed when they were there. Think about that for a moment. When a person leaves your life, they do not simply take their presence with them. They often take routines, memories, expectations, dreams, and even parts of your identity that became attached to them. That is why some departures feel far more painful than logic can explain. It is not only because you miss the person, it is because you no longer know who you are without the role they played in your story. Perhaps they were the person who made you feel valued. Perhaps they were the person you imagined your future with. Perhaps they were the person whose approval you spent years trying to earn, and when they disappeared, something inside you began asking questions you never expected to face. Who am I now? What does my future look like now? What happens if the life I imagined never happens? This is why loss can feel so disorienting, because it does not only challenge your emotions, it challenges your identity, and identity is one of the deepest foundations of the human mind. Chosen one. Most people spend years building their sense of self around external things: relationships, careers, recognition, status, the opinions of others. Without realizing it, they slowly hand pieces of their identity away. One piece to a relationship, one piece to a job, one piece to another person's approval, until one day something leaves, and suddenly they feel as though they have lost themselves. But what if this season is revealing something important? What if God is showing you that your identity was never supposed to depend on things that could be taken away? Because anything that can be removed was never meant to be the foundation of who you are. That is why growth often feels uncomfortable. Growth requires separation from false identities, and false identities rarely leave quietly. They fight to stay. They create fear. They create doubt. They convince you that without certain people, certain opportunities, or certain circumstances, you cannot be whole. But that is an illusion. The truth is, many chosen ones are not grieving a person, they are grieving a version of themselves. A version that felt safe, a version that felt accepted, a version that felt certain about where life was going. And while that grief is real, it is also part of the transformation. Because sometimes God allows an identity to break before he reveals a deeper one. The identity built on approval must give way to the identity built on purpose. The identity built on attachment must give way to the identity built on faith. The identity built on fear must give way to the identity built on truth. And this is why your current season feels so intense. You are not simply recovering from a loss. You are undergoing a reconstruction. The old foundation is being questioned. The old assumptions are being challenged. The old version of you is slowly losing its grip. And while that process feels uncomfortable, it is creating space for something stronger. Because one day you will realize that the person who left did not take your future with them. They only exposed how much of your identity had been placed in something temporary. And once that realization takes root, you stop chasing what left. You stop begging for what was not meant to stay. And you begin discovering who you are when your value no longer depends on anyone else's presence, approval, or permission. Chosen one, there is another spiritual law that many people resist because it does not feel like a blessing when it first appears. In fact, it often feels like the exact opposite. It is the principle that God often removes before he multiplies. Most people pray for increase. They pray for greater opportunities, greater influence, greater peace, greater abundance. But very few people are prepared for what usually happens before those things arrive. Because before God adds, he often subtracts. Before he expands, he simplifies. Before he multiplies, he removes what can no longer grow with you. This is one of the most misunderstood seasons in a chosen one's journey. When a job ends unexpectedly, when a relationship falls apart, when friendships begin fading, when a door you desperately wanted closes, the natural reaction is to focus on what was lost. You ask yourself why it happened. You wonder why God allowed it. You question whether you made a mistake. But what if the removal itself is part of the answer? What if God is not taking something from you? What if he is creating room for something larger than what currently exists? Think about a gardener for a moment. A gardener does not prune a healthy tree because he wants to destroy it. He prunes it because growth requires removal. Dead branches consume energy, overgrown branches block sunlight, and if nothing is cut away, the tree eventually limits its own potential. The same principle often applies to your life. Sometimes what God removes is not necessarily bad. It is simply no longer aligned with where you are going. A relationship may have been right for one season, but not for the next. A job may have taught you important lessons, but cannot take you where your future is leading. Certain friendships may have provided comfort while quietly limiting your growth. And because we become attached to what is familiar, we often mistake necessary endings for permanent losses. But chosen one, every expansion requires space. Nothing new can fully enter a life that is already overcrowded with what belongs to yesterday. This is why many people pray for multiplication while simultaneously holding on to everything God is trying to remove. They ask for a new chapter while refusing to release the old one. They ask for transformation while protecting the very habits that keep them stuck. They ask for elevation while clinging to environments that no longer challenge them. And then they wonder why nothing changes. The truth is, multiplication begins long before the blessing becomes visible. It begins the moment God starts clearing what cannot accompany you into the next season. That is why some of the most important moments in your life may not look like victories at first. They may look like disappointments. They may look like delays. They may look like closed doors. Yet years later, you often discover that the thing you fought hardest to keep was the very thing preventing your growth. And the thing you cried over losing was actually making room for something far greater. Chosen one. If God has been removing people, opportunities, habits, or attachments from your life lately, do not rush to label the process as punishment. Sometimes removal is evidence of preparation. Sometimes subtraction is evidence of expansion. And sometimes the blessing does not begin when something arrives. Sometimes the blessing begins when something leaves. Because God knows that what He is preparing to multiply in your life requires more room than your current season can provide. And that is why what feels like loss today may eventually become the reason for the abundance, clarity, and purpose you experience tomorrow. Chosen one. This is the moment many people misunderstand. It is the moment when everything feels uncertain, the moment when old doors have closed, but new doors have not yet opened, the moment when prayers seem unanswered, the moment when silence feels louder than any response. And because nothing appears to be happening, many people assume they have been forgotten. But what if the very thing making you feel abandoned is actually evidence that you are being prepared? Think about that carefully. What if this season was never meant to prove God's absence? What if it was designed to reveal His work in places you cannot yet see? Because preparation rarely looks like progress while you are living through it. It often feels like waiting. It feels like confusion. It feels like standing in the middle of a chapter that makes no sense. Yet some of the most important work God does happens beneath the surface, just as roots grow before fruit appears, just as foundations are laid before a building rises, just as a seed disappears into the ground before it breaks through the soil. The process looks like loss before it looks like growth. And that is where many people quit. They leave the process because they mistake construction for destruction. They assume that because something is being removed, nothing is being built. But chosen one, the blessing was not delayed. The receiver was still being built. Read that again in your spirit. The blessing was not delayed. The receiver was still being built. Because what God is preparing for you requires a version of you that does not yet think the way you used to think. A version of you that is no longer controlled by fear. A version of you that does not need constant approval. a version of you that can carry greater responsibility without being destroyed by it. And that kind of transformation cannot happen overnight. It must be developed, refined, strengthened. This is why some prayers seem to take longer than expected. Not because God is withholding the answer, but because He is preparing the person who will receive it. Imagine receiving everything you asked for, while still carrying the same insecurities, the same fears, and the same emotional wounds. The blessing itself could become a burden. The opportunity could become overwhelming. The responsibility could crush you. So before God changes your circumstances, He often changes you. Before He transforms your environment, He transforms your character. Before He expands your life, He expands your capacity. That is what this season has been about. Not punishment, not abandonment, preparation. And one day, you will look back at the moments that made the least sense and realize they were quietly shaping the person you needed to become. Because, chosen one, what feels like a delay from your perspective may actually be divine timing from God's perspective. And when the season finally changes, you will understand something most people never do. The greatest blessing was not only what God brought into your life. The greatest blessing was who He transformed you into while you were waiting. Chosen one, by now you may be wondering how to recognize whether this season of preparation is truly happening in your life. The truth is, transformation often leaves clues before the results become visible. Most people are looking for dramatic signs. They expect a sudden breakthrough, a major opportunity, an immediate answer. But spiritual transformation usually begins in quieter ways. It starts inside you long before it changes the world around you. And if you pay attention, there are signs. The first sign is that old things no longer attract you the way they once did. Activities that once consumed your attention begin to feel empty. Conversations that once excited you now feel repetitive. Goals that once seemed important suddenly lose their power over you. At first, this can feel confusing. You may wonder, what is wrong? But nothing is wrong. You are simply outgrowing what once fit your previous season. The second sign is that you feel lonelier than before. This is one of the hardest parts of transformation. Not because nobody is around you, but because fewer people understand what is happening within you. You may find yourself withdrawing from environments that no longer align with your spirit. You may feel disconnected from conversations that once felt natural. And while loneliness can be uncomfortable, it is often the space where clarity begins to grow. The third sign is that your intuition becomes stronger. You start sensing things before they happen. You notice subtle warnings. You feel guided away from certain situations without fully understanding why. What once seemed like coincidence begins to feel like direction. This does not mean you suddenly have all the answers. It means you are becoming more sensitive to the guidance that was always present, but often drowned out by noise. The fourth sign is that certain relationships begin leaving your life naturally. Notice that I said naturally, not through force, not through conflict, not through revenge. People simply drift away. Conversations become less frequent, connections become weaker, paths begin moving in different directions. And while this can feel painful, it often reflects a deeper truth. Not everyone assigned to your past is assigned to your future. Some relationships are seasonal. Their purpose was to teach, prepare, or reveal something within you. And once that purpose is complete, the connection gradually releases itself. The fifth sign is perhaps the most important of all. You begin thinking differently. The situations that once triggered fear no longer control you. The opinions of others lose some of their power. You become less focused on proving yourself and more focused on understanding yourself. You stop asking, how do I make everyone accept me? And begin asking, how do I remain aligned with who I am becoming? This shift changes everything. Because transformation is not measured by what you gain. It is measured by what no longer controls you. Chosen one, if you recognize these signs in your life, do not dismiss them. They may not look like the blessing you expected, but they may be evidence that the process has already begun. Because before God changes your circumstances, He often changes your perspective. And once your perspective changes, your entire future begins changing with it. Chosen one, as this message comes to a close, there is one final truth you need to hear, a truth that many people spend years searching for but never fully understand. Perhaps the greatest transformation happening in your life right now has nothing to do with what God is about to give you. Perhaps it has everything to do with who you are becoming. For so long, you may have believed that the answer to your struggles was somewhere outside of you, a bigger opportunity, more money, a better relationship, greater recognition, more support from the people around you. And while there is nothing wrong with desiring those things, there comes a moment in every chosen one's journey when God begins teaching a deeper lesson, a lesson that cannot be learned through success alone. The lesson that your value was never meant to depend on what you possess. It was never meant to depend on who stays. It was never meant to depend on who applauds you. Because anything that gives you your value can also take it away. And God does not want your identity resting on something that fragile. That is why this season has felt different. It has not only been removing people, it has been removing illusions. The illusion that you need everyone's approval. The illusion that your worth depends on achievement. The illusion that your future depends on a specific person, a specific opportunity, or a specific outcome. Little by little, those illusions have been breaking apart. And while the process has been uncomfortable, it has also been freeing, because every illusion that falls away creates room for truth. And the truth is this: you are not valuable because someone chooses you. You are valuable because God created you. You are not worthy because people recognize you. You are worthy before they ever do. You are not important because the world celebrates you. You are important because your purpose existed long before anyone noticed it. Chosen one, maybe the greatest thing God is preparing for you is not wealth, not status, not influence, not recognition. Maybe the greatest thing He is preparing is a version of you that no longer needs those things in order to know your worth. A version of you that remains grounded, whether people stay or leave. A version of you that remains confident, whether doors open or close. A version of you that trusts God's direction more than public opinion. Because when you become that person, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing validation. You stop chasing approval. You stop chasing what was never meant to define you. And strangely enough, the things you once chased begin moving toward you. Not because you are desperately seeking them, but because you are finally prepared to receive them without being controlled by them. That is the paradox most people never discover. The person who constantly seeks validation rarely finds peace, but the person who finds peace within God's purpose no longer depends on validation. The person who desperately chases significance often feels empty, but the person who lives with purpose naturally becomes significant. And perhaps that is what this entire season has been preparing you for. Not simply a new opportunity, not simply a new relationship, not simply a new chapter, but a new understanding of who you truly are. So, if this season has felt confusing, trust the process. If it has felt lonely, trust the process. If it has felt slow, trust the process. Because one day you will look back and realize that what seemed like loss was actually refinement. What seemed like delay was actually preparation. And what seemed like the ending of your story was really the beginning of the person you were always meant to become. Chosen one, your greatest blessing may not be what arrives next. Your greatest blessing may be the person you become before it arrives.